This episode of Untold Stories is underwritten by Winds Market, Sunshine Ace Hardware, Collier County Government County Commission, District School Board of Collier County, City of Naples City Council, Collier County Museum, and the Baron Collier Jr. Foundation.
This is Marco Island, sometimes called Florida's last frontier. Marco presents a panorama of verdant splendor. The largest of the 10,000 islands, Marco has the highest elevation, rising in the interior to over 50 feet above sea level.
In 1964, Marco Island was poised to become one of Southwest Florida's real estate superstars. Within 20 years, however, the last frontier would be called the last paradise, when it became one of the last developments of its kind in Florida. A century before dredge and fill development carved canals and homesites into Florida's last frontier, Marco was an untamed and nearly unknown no man's land.
It was so isolated and remote that you couldn't get there except by sailboat. And so 3 little communities developed around at the same time in 1870, Marco, Caxambas, and Goodland Point.
More than 400 years before, Spanish explorers called the island San Marco and dubbed the southwestern shore Caxambas, place of wells, giving a valuable tip to future explorers. Goodland was named by pioneer Johnny Roberts, but the name proved to be misleading.
He named it for the good, rich black soil, not realizing that the soil was only 2 inches deep.
The remote island was inhabited by a handful of squatters when W.T. Collier arrived with his family in 1870. He bought out the squatters, built a house on the northern tip of the island, and began farming.
The pioneers who came here originally came for farming, and the soil covering the shell mounds was so rich that it grew enormous vegetables.
In Caxambas, the pioneers discovered the soil was ideally suited for pineapples.
Frederick Ludlow had a huge pineapple plantation and a packing plant. And then across the river on Horace Island, now called Key Marco, there was another huge pineapple factory and packing plant.
Most of the island's produce was shipped to the Key West market on board one of W.D. Collier's schooners. Son of W.T. Collier, W.D., affectionately known as Captain Bill, became the driving force behind the development of the village of Marco. The energetic entrepreneur built boats, operated a general store, and became the island's first postmaster in 1888. The new post office housed in Captain Bill's store was mistakenly called Malco, a name taken from an early map of Florida. Ever the entrepreneur, Captain Bill opened his house to the growing number of sportsmen coming to Marco to fish for tarpon. Advertising, $2 a day, and you must provide your own fish or fowl. He shrewdly saw the potential of the island and opened the Marco Hotel in 1896, offering 20 rooms and an unheard-of convenience, a 2-story outhouse. The outlandish outhouse caught the attention of Robert Ripley, who included it in his Believe It or Not column. Visitors to the hotel in the spring of 1896 also saw another strange sight: men digging in a muck pond, searching for ancient treasures. Captain Bill's wife, Margaret, wrote in her journal,
Mr. Cushing and party are digging for curios. When they find anything nice, they all give a yell, and Mr. Cushing shakes hands with the one who made the find.
Leading the expedition was Frank Hamilton Cushing, a self-educated anthropologist who by chance had seen some strange items Captain Bill had found while digging in the muck near the hotel.
When he learned of these Key Marco finds, he came and did as good archaeology as anyone was doing at the time, and better in some cases. He was the first person to use a grid to divide an archaeological site into squares and record what was found in each square. The finds were extraordinary. As soon as he began to dig in the muck, he realized that these were finds that had never been duplicated anyplace in the United States.
Digging in the dense muck, however, was extremely difficult.
They had to basically dig ditches and try to drain the water out as best they could. The other big challenge they had was in preserving the artifacts as they came out of the ground.
In his preliminary report to the American Philosophical Society, Cushing noted,
"It was distressing to feel that even by merely exposing them and inspecting them, we were dooming so many of them to destruction."
Although many artifacts were lost, almost all of Cushing's finds were preserved on paper by the expedition artist Wells Sawyer.
He not only took photographs of the materials, but he did watercolors, very realistic watercolors. So as soon as a mask or a statue or whatever came out of the ground, Wells Sawyer would immediately draw a watercolor of it. It was the equivalent of color photography at the time, which of course didn't exist.
Cushing's finds ranged from remarkably preserved fishing nets and tools to magnificently carved and painted wooden objects. In his preliminary report, Cushing raved about the artifact that would become his most famous find.
"Nothing thus far found in America so vividly calls to mind the best art of the ancient Egyptians or Assyrians as does this little statuette of the lion god. Although it is barely 6 inches in height, its lines are to the last degree masterly."
Cushing's finds, now dated to around 600 to 800 AD, provide rare insight into the mysterious people who lived in Southwest Florida nearly 2,000 years ago.
Before Cushing's expedition, we just had a few scattered Spanish documents that related any information about the Calusa. After Cushing's expedition, we had a better appreciation not only of their artistic achievements and their just remarkable complexity of their culture, but also about what they did for a living, which was fishing. They were almost entirely a fishing people, not an agricultural population at all.
Cushing died before he could complete his final report, and the dig was abandoned. Marco returned to obscurity, a rustic retreat for sportsmen, in the boondocks, and barely on the map. By the early 1900s, just over 100 people were living on Marco Island, including the Olds family, who built a home on the Marco River.
Charles and Mary were homeopathic doctors, and they came to Marco Island to practice their medicine.
The family supplemented their income by growing fruit trees, including several varieties of mangoes. Saloma Olds was an avid photographer, and her images now offer rare glimpses of everyday life on the island in the early 1900s.
She took pictures of all the boats going up and down the river, the family, their visitors, everything, and she would develop the pictures herself when they had ice. She said cold water didn't work as well, and so she would wait for her papa to bring in ice from Fort Myers so that she could develop her pictures.
Farming and fishing continued to be the mainstays of island life until 1905, when E.S. Burnham opened up a clam canning factory in Caxambas. The factory was the brainchild of Caxambas pioneer James Barfield, who saw the potential of the rich clam beds and offered Burnham a choice waterfront site. Anticipating the growth of the village, Barfield built a large boarding house for single workers and 10 cottages for workers with families. The clam diggers camped on outlying islands and harvested the clams by hand, until Captain Bill revolutionized the industry by inventing a mechanized dredge. Preston Sawyer worked on the dredge and recalled,
"The clams extended from shoreline all the way to Lostman's Key for 50 miles. When the dredge started, they could dredge 5 times as much as all the hand diggers. We took 300 to 500 bushels a day for 9 months of the year. We lived on this barge. We had the kitchen, and we had hard bunks with no mattresses. I had to be young. I don't know how I lived through it, but I did."
The highly efficient dredge drew the attention of New York clam canning magnate J. Harvey Doxey, who visited the island in 1910. A year later, he opened a sprawling factory on land Captain Bill had given him on the north side of the island, in a protected harbor now called Factory Bay. Both canneries were vital to the island's economy. Hazel Pettit Griffin worked in the Doxey factory in 1924 and remembered,
"Doxey paid me 21 cents an hour, and I was glad to get it, as most people were. He employed about 30 to 40 men and women at the cannery."
The booming clam industry eventually lured a railroad to the remote island.
The Atlantic Coast Railway line came in 1927, and they made 2 trips a day to get clams from both factories, and that lasted for 20 years. And then the clam beds began to decline and the railroad stopped running.
Since the train was primarily used for freight, a depot was never built, and there was only one reliable way to get to the island, by boat. In 1912, a one-car ferry began operating from the north shore of the island. The ferry, dubbed the J.H. Doxy, crossed over to the mainland at what is now called Isles of Capri. The ferry was the result of relentless lobbying by a woman who would one day be called the Queen of Marco Island, Tommy Barfield.
She became the first female lobbyist even before women had the right to vote. She had to go by sailboat to Fort Myers because we were part of Lee County. And she would lobby for schools, for teachers, for amenities for the island. The Lee County Commissioners did not want to spend any money in the outlying districts.
In 1922, Tommy Barfield's dedication to Marco caught the attention of Baron Gift Collier, the millionaire advertising magnate who had purchased almost 1 million acres in southern Lee County and nearly all of Marco Island.
She wanted to be at the county meeting to be sure that some of the back taxes benefited Marco Island. He apparently heard her speak, and he later told her that he admired her tactics, her strategy, and her tenacity.
A year later, Tommy Barfield played a pivotal role in the creation of the new Collier County. Baron Collier soon joined forces with the San Marco Corporation to begin developing the island. As part of the development plan, the state legislature agreed to rename the entire island Collier City in 1927. A celebration was held on the grounds of the Marco Hotel, but 2 years later, the Depression turned the dreamed-of boom into a bust. Collier City never became a reality, although the name remained on the books until 1957. The economy of the island received another blow when the Burnham factory was destroyed by a hurricane in 1932. Declining clam beds eventually forced Doxy to close his cannery as well. He tore down the buildings and opened a 90-space trailer park. The languishing island received an unexpected boost in 1936 when a bridge to Marco was finally approved as a public works project. The wooden trestle bridge connected Goodland to the mainland and featured a hand-cranked swing span, a hand-me-down from a bridge in Fort Myers. Despite the island's growing reputation as a sport fishing destination, by the late 1930s, only a handful of accommodations were available for visitors, including Captain Bill's Hotel, now called the Marco Inn, the nearby Marco Lodge, and the Barfield House in Caxambas. The ever-enterprising Tommy Barfield found a creative solution to the lack of rooms in Goodland by having an abandoned houseboat towed to the village, where the hulk was converted into the landmark Ship Ahoy Restaurant and Inn. Goodland remained the smallest community on the island until 1949, when Baron Collier's sons began to revive their father's dream of developing Marco. The three brothers planned to start on the south tip of the island, but the village of Caxambas was in the way.
They offered to sell people property in Goodland and move those homes free, no money down, 3 years to pay, reasonable terms. So in 1949, 18 homes and businesses moved from the little village of Caxambas overland to Goodland. And Goodland Point became the village of Goodland overnight one summer.
The Colliers' plans for Caxambas ended 6 years later with the untimely deaths of two of Baron Collier's sons. The once bustling village remained a ghost town until the late 1950s, when a missile tracking station was installed on the southwestern tip of the island. The station would remain a lonely outpost until a new group of developers rediscovered the remote island. Again, three brothers would take on the task: Robert, Elliot, and Frank Mackle Jr., the respected founders of the Deltona Corporation and the renowned developers of more than a dozen Florida communities. In 1964, the Mackles joined forces with the Collier heirs to form the Marco Island Development Corporation. Within 4 years, the brothers would buy out the Colliers, and most of Marco Island would become theirs for $7 million. A 5-phase implementation plan was created for the complex of canals and homesites designed by chief planner Jimmy Wenzel. Wenzel also named most of the roads and included Deltona's signature street, Elkham, Mackle spelled backwards, in his plan.
Recently, a new era has begun. Great earth movers are changing the face of Marco, changing the pace, moving to a new concept of the future. The making of this beautiful subtropic island into the most amazing project ever imagined.
Our primary revenue source was in land sales. The ultimate goal was to build houses and homes and condominiums, but the cycle that Deltona was in was to design a master plan community and sell lots and generate revenue streams that way. The early housing business was moderate, to say the least. The island grew slowly at first, but the land sales took off very quickly.
Construction began immediately on a 50-room hotel, 22 model homes, and a large sales office.
This is the Marco Island headquarters of Florida's famous Mackle brothers, whose daring and imagination is creating a new future for Marco Island.
The first sign of any civilization was the Deltona's administration building, which is where most of us worked.
The centerpiece of the building was a large model of the planned community, an essential sales tool for selling property that didn't exist yet.
See it as it will be, as we take to the air and fly over this sensational three-dimensional model, constructed with absolute detail to show the Marco of the future.
Much of the property that I sold, my first lot that I sold, was actually underwater.
I purchased a very nice lot on the western side of 951. I bought, really, it was basically swampland. So yes, it was sight unseen, but because the Mackle brothers had such a good reputation, I was willing to take that risk.
To generate interest in the remote island, Deltona launched an aggressive advertising campaign.
We had a very sophisticated marketing program which brought people to Marco through weekend trips and sold them on that dream of a future community like this.
Deltona's chartered planes landed on a rough road in front of the hotel. Eventually, a small airport was built north of the island, and the company started Marco Island Airways. The company's inviting South Seas theme helped sell the dream of living on the island.
They used to have like a tiki boat that you could go out on, and one of the best sales tools we had was putting people on this and then taking them up and down the canals and showing them the houses by the water.
Even the model homes were planned with a Polynesian flair designed to bring the outdoors in.
When they walk in that front door, they look through the living room. They don't see the kitchen, no matter how small the house was. You see the glass sliding doors and the screen. If they had a pool or a little garden on the other side, that is what they wanted people to see when they came into a home. And that was one of the greatest selling points, I think, that we had.
Plans called for the construction of more than 125 miles of roads, 90 miles of seawalled canals, and 12,000 home sites. The massive undertaking prompted Professional Builder magazine to estimate that Deltona was the largest owner of residential construction equipment in the country. Marco's first high-rise condominium building, the Emerald Beach, opened in 1966. A year later, Deltona broke ground on 2 more condos, and the buildings sold out in 3 weeks, even before completion. Demand for a piece of Deltona's paradise soon overwhelmed the little hotel on the beach.
It was obvious that there was a demand for a much larger facility, and in the late 60s my dad commissioned Herb Savage in the architectural department to design a truly world-class resort here, and sent Herb Savage to Hawaii and the islands to get a sense and a feel of the flavor of that kind of architecture. And he brought that back and designed this hotel that you see today.
the hotel became the centerpiece of the development and a vital sales tool.
They'd walk into that hotel and look out and see the Gulf of Mexico and all the palm trees. It was really a wow. And people responded to that and said, maybe we ought to invest here.
The Islanders and Deltona received another boost in 1968 when a new bridge was approved for the island.
A bridge was badly needed, and there had been plans in the works for years to build the bridge to the north, and that was really a big part of helping Marco mature at that stage. It was a toll bridge in the early days.
Unlike most developers at that time, the Mackles donated land for churches, libraries, and other community facilities.
They thought of themselves as not as developers so much, but as city builders.
By the early 1970s, 2 of Deltona's development phases on the island were complete, and the remaining 3 were nearly sold out when disaster struck. Dredging permits, once issued in less than 9 days, were denied for Big Key, Barfield Bay, and Collier Bay. At the same time, Deltona announced plans to dredge and fill an area of mangroves on the mainland, adjacent to Rookery Bay, and environmental groups leapt into action.
There were hearings every year for 12 years, and the directions would change with time, particularly after '76, when the Army Corps, they came in and rejected the Barfield Bay and Big Key permits, which was an immense blow to Deltona, but granted them Collier Bay.
We went into the final days in mid-April of 1976 absolutely confident we were going to get those permits.
Despite strong support for Deltona, the company was granted only the Collier Bay permit, and a long series of appeals and lawsuits ensued. There was little or no support for the mangrove trees at the root of Deltona's permitting problems.
They were junk vegetation, and wetlands were just nothing but a nuisance, so nobody had much of an idea of the importance, the contribution, the nursery function, the food production areas that were there. So you look like somebody who was just trying to destroy another man's dream. And Frank Mackle, he dreamed big. And he was a good businessman, he was an aggressive guy, and he was a gentleman. I liked Frank Mackle. We just didn't agree.
Thousands of people had bought into the Mackle brothers' dream, and Deltona was in dire straits.
I guess I was first notified about this around 1973 or 74, which was about 2 or 3 years after I had purchased it. But at that time, they were basically just saying that, you know, they were involved in litigation and they had hoped that they would prevail, etc. Well, towards the late 70s, it became pretty evident that they would not prevail and that my lot would never be built. So, of course, I was a little bit concerned about that at that time, but the Mackle brothers were perhaps some of the most honest builders that I have ever run into. They actually either refunded or and somehow compensated every purchaser that had bought a lot whose lot was not completed.
Bankruptcy was never discussed. In hindsight, we probably would have been a lot better off. We, as a family and perhaps as a company, might have been better off with bankruptcy, but it was never a consideration.
True to their word, the Mackles reached an agreement with more than 7,000 contract holders, but at great price. The company was forced to sell many of its assets, including the Marco Beach Hotel and Villas and choice beachfront building sites. Although Deltona did finish its permitted Collier Bay section and other projects along the beach, the Mackle brothers' dream ended forever in 1982.
The Supreme Court rejected the request to review it, and so the decision stood and there were no more appeals possible.
The environmental movement had become so strong that ended up where they denied about 1/3 of Marco Island's development, and then everything north of Marco was denied as waterfront community.
People still come here and say how magnificent it is, and it is. But not the dream that they contemplated, and would have had we been allowed to go ahead and finish the island.
It would be left to other developers to carry on the Mackle brothers' dream, but their vision had already created a lasting legacy. Never again would such a large complex of dredge and fill canals be allowed in Florida.
He had great vision, not just for Marco, but for the 10 other communities or 12 other communities that he built over his lifetime. He could come over here, see that white sand beach, and in spite of the mangroves and the lack of water and the other challenges, see the great city that it could be. He set the foundation. He and Herb and Jimmy laid the foundation for this great island, but it's the people that live here that have really brought it into what he hoped it would be, and we're very grateful for that.
To purchase a copy of this and other WGCU produced programs, go to WGCU.org or call 1-888-824-0030. This program was produced for the citizens of Southwest Florida by WGCU Public Media. Show your appreciation for programs like these. Become a member of WGCU, a business supporter, or leave a legacy through estate or planned gift. Call or visit our website at WGCU.org.